This is a show for grown-ups.
And they say bad words.
And they say bad words.
Say final warning.
Final warning.
Hello, and welcome to another sensual episode of The Pot of Blunders. This is an in-between episode in which we don't play a game. We talk about something game-related. My name is Nate Magnuski. I am your host. And because of the topic of this game, which is romance in RPGs, I wanted to invite the love of my life to talk today with me. But Richard couldn't make it, so I asked my wife to be here instead.
Acceptable. I know better than to get into the middle of your bromance.
You are as smart as you are beautiful. With me today is my romantic love of my life. My beautiful wife, Jenna Peterson Magnuski. This is where you say hi, baby.
Hi, baby.
When I first came to you and said, Jen, do you want to be on to talk about romance in games? What were your first thoughts?
My first thoughts were mostly that sound.
Yeah.
But then we started talking about just like bandying back and forth about the subject, and we ended up having a pretty, I think, good conversation about it. And I think having had that conversation really kind of changed my mind on approaching it.
Because I think that's the worry with anything with romance in games. As soon as you hear, oh, we're going to have romance in our TTRPG, I think it's like a visceral, like, recoil reaction to be like, I don't want any part of that. That sounds horrendous and fraught with the potential for really upsetting content.
Well, and especially depending on who your group is and the maturity level, or if, you know, you have a couple single people and one of them's kind of interested in the, like, there's a lot of out of game social aspects that can really strongly affect whether or not it's appropriate in game.
Absolutely. So let's dive right into it, and let's start off talking about how you make sure that your group is ready for that kind of thing. And it all starts for me with a session zero. Session zeros in role-playing games are when everyone gets together before you start the actual adventure, and you talk about your expectations. You talk about the kind of game it's going to be, what people can expect, both in terms of what the DM can expect from the players, what the players can expect from the DM, and what they can expect from each other.
This is a good thing to talk about, whether it's about romance or about anything else, because if even on the base level, like if I'm expecting a goofy game and you're expecting a really serious game, neither of us are going to have a good time because we're going to be working against each other constantly.
Right, and neither one is better than the other. It's just a matter of setting expectations. You know, your group, you might prefer like a goofy game, like you said, and there's a group out there that's going to run with that and excel at it. And just like the serious role player is going to want, very high stakes, very maybe emotionally driven game, and that's great too. But it might be oil and water for the two of you to get together at the same table.
Right. It's not so much like, hey, you want to talk about romance, have a session zero. It's have a session zero, consider bringing up romance.
And if, say you bring this up and people say, oh yeah, I'm all on board with that. Romance sounds great. It's a fun little aspect. You need to be explicit on the type of romance that's expected and accepted. So is this a player on NPC romance? The old joke is some neckbeard is playing their character and they want to seduce every woman character in the game. They go into a tavern and there's a cute barmaid and they try to lure them back to their room because they're creepy. A player might be okay with that. That doesn't mean the DM is automatically okay with playing that seduced character, or that other people at the table want to be there to experience that alongside of you. So you need to be very clear on what kind of boundaries you want. And further on that, how about player and player romance? I've seen a few examples in my time at the table where, like you had mentioned earlier, Jen, someone's sweet on another player at the table, and they think, hey, the best way I can show my worth is to woo their character. And the person at the table, maybe it's most of the cases I've seen, it's the only woman at the table who's the target of these amorous advances that has to deal with that now, when she just wanted to play an elf and stab something with a sword. And if you're the GM and you think this might be a problem, this is why you need to have a session zero where you discuss this kind of stuff.
If there are any people in relationships around the table, that can get real awkward if one of the people starts a relationship with not their real life partner.
Is everyone comfortable with that. It's play pretend, it's all make-believe, that's great, but there are real people pretending to be these people. It's like wearing a bunch of masks. It's all
Right.
surface and show, but there might be history there, or there might just be a lack of comfort with that.
Right.
And that's okay.
And depending on, we'll talk later about how far you go in playing this aspect, but if you discuss being okay with a more physically described interaction, that can get real weird.
Yeah.
If, you have people who are in relationship or third wheel or what, like there's a lot of social aspects to consider. All the time, always session 0.
Don't assume your player's character's sexuality. Ask them as part of session 0. Maybe they're asexual, they don't want romance as part of it, or aromantic, and they don't want romance part of it. Maybe they're a straight person RPing a gay person. There's a broad spectrum out there. Don't assume just because someone's playing a woman, they're a heterosexual woman. Don't assume someone's playing a man is going to be open to sexual advances on their character just because the person outside of the game is heterosexual and fairly willing to explore that part in real life. They might not want that in the game. Talk about it, make sure there's no hurt feelings and no weird things that might come up.
Well, it makes me think about, the things that previously working on college campuses talking about what you're okay with on a date. It's a potentially vulnerable situation you're putting yourself in. It's the conversation about consent, and you need consent even in make-believe.
So as a DM, it's one of your jobs to empower your players to speak up for themselves and to say what they're okay with and what they're not okay with. But what someone's okay with in theory doesn't always match what they're okay with in practice. They might get into a situation where they go, you know what? This is actually really gross or inappropriate, and I do not want any part of it. And luckily, there are safety tools that are very well established throughout the RPG world. Though we're going to talk about it in the realm of romance, these are handy for everything. So one of the first things we should talk about is lines and veils.
So a line is a thing that you never ever cross, and a veil is something that you can kind of brush against. So like everybody kind of knows what is being implied, but they aren't fully describing it. I compare this to the 1966 Batman movie where Miss Kitka brings Bruce Wayne back to her apartment, and everybody kind of knows what's about to happen, but they don't really talk about it. If it were have to continued, they would have had them like jump to them eating breakfast the next morning still in Miss Kitka's house, and he's wearing his clothes from last night. The suggestion without actually showing what has happened.
It's tell, don't show.
Right.
It's versus the way stories are supposed to be told, which is show, don't tell. An example of a line for me is anything to do with violence against kids. I just don't want it in my game. If it shows up, I'm not having a good time, and I'm probably just going to leave, and I'm not going to play with that group again. A veil for me is something like my friend wants to roll to seduce the troll. That's fine. I don't want a graphic description of their Congress necessarily. You know what I mean?
What you're saying is you want it to be very clear that they went into their twin beds after.
Right. And maybe they pushed those beds together. Maybe they took the nightstand out of the middle, pushed them together, clicked both their side lamps off, and went at it. I don't need to know the specifics of it. It happened, and we're moving on. Even with those safety tools in place, there's one more that everyone should know about, and I think we've talked about in this podcast at least once before. It's the X card. This was put into popularity by John, and I'm sorry, John, if I'm going to mangle your last name, Stavropoulos. So when you're playing in the same space together, it's just convenient to have an actual card with the letter X drawn on it that's within easy reach of all the players. And if something's happening in the game that someone doesn't like, all they have to do is touch that card. That's all they have to do. GM or player alike. Touch that card, and it just stops. No real explanation needed. Whatever happened gets retconned out, and you move forward. Occasionally, you might need to ask, like, okay, I didn't understand what specifically you had a problem with, and that's okay. And as a player, it's okay to give the briefest answer you can, as long as it translates to the other person you're explaining it to so they understand what you had a problem with.
for the purposes of knowing what needs to be retconned.
Exactly.
Not because they need to know necessarily, but also because then it also helps them avoid it in the future. So
Right.
you don't have an issue with, just to kind of come back to the romance aspect, you do something that is more in the realm of a dominator or a dominatrix. And they are not okay with that role. And they, hit the X card and they say, I'm not comfortable with the BDSM aspects. That's literally all you have to say. You don't have to go into why or, have the other person justify why they thought it was okay to do. It's really just it's that, okay. And then going back. And that can be done with literally anything that could be upsetting in a game. It doesn't have to be, we're talking about it for romance purposes, romance and sexuality, but it doesn't have to be centric on that. Like you said, you don't want to see violence against kids in games. If somebody doesn't know that, or it came up kind of unexpectedly, like you didn't think necessarily you needed to include that as a line before, you can still hit the X card for something like that.
The only time people kind of get a little funky with that is when they say, oh, it ruins my verisimilitude. It takes me out of the experience because we had to retcon something.
Yeah, but it's more important that the game is enjoyable and feels like a fun and safe environment to everybody.
And when you're dealing with these kind of very fraught, very emotional situations in games, if you're really role-playing and you have a lot of that vulnerability, you need to include more islands of safety in that. Say more opportunities for them to say, I'm not comfortable with this. Even to the point where you can introduce, like if you're not in a physical space, because right now we're smack dab in the middle of COVID still, you might not have the opportunity to just touch an X card.
Just saying X card.
Make a safety word. And if you want to take it one step further, you can do the whole yellow, red safety words where yellow you say when like, this is getting uncomfortable and I'm feeling very vulnerable here, but I want to see where this is going to go. And red being like, okay, full stop. Nope, it's done. So, Jen, it sounds like this is a risky proposition to have romance in your games at all. Why bother with it? Is it important? Is it worth the risks?
I mean, to me, it's a really human experience. And romance and sexuality is everywhere in books and movies and music. It's something that we're fascinated with. So if it's something that appeals to your group to explore also in the game, why not?
For most people, I won't say all people, relationships, romance, sexuality are part of their base level experience. And some games, they're romantically based. They're going to focus on this because that is a primary focus of the game. Really listen to that. Some games are romantically based, and there's no avoiding it.
Other games also have it kind of in our social scripts that's a place that romance is explored. So like teen dramas are a lot of times very flirty, very sexual tension-y. It's just kind of baked into that genre. So, if you're playing a game like Masks that involves teens that are just coming into their power and building a social group and trying to figure out who they are and whatever, it might come up because that's part of how we think of teens interacting. Even if you're not playing a romantically centered game, being mindful of types of games where it may arise, I don't want to say naturally, but like sort of subconsciously, I think is important.
And so, like you said, Jen, this is part of normal life for most people. It's part of most of media that we consume on some level or other. And so, thankfully, if you're looking to include romance in your games, there's a real clear roadmap of how to do that. And you don't need to look any further than your friendly local Hallmark movie, because they have it down to a science. And I'm sure I said that, and a lot of you are rolling your eyes out there, but it works. And it's existed for as long as it has, these tropes around romance, because it works. Kind of like the hero's journey for fantasy, there are formulaic ways these things move through a story before they reach a resolution. You have the meeting of the two people. You have an obstacle that comes between them. You have them overcoming that obstacle. And then there's a misunderstanding that drives them apart again. And then ultimately there's a reconciliation. Just to prove that it works, I'm going to spring this on Jen. I don't think she knows about this at all. You and I, Jen, are going to come up with a Hallmark movie plot right now. No pressure, okay? All right, so do you want to do heteronormative with this, or you don't want to mix it up?
If we're going Hallmark, most of it is heteronormative, although not all, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that they're starting to kind of mix that up a little bit.
I'm waiting for the first, like, bi love triangle. I just don't think they're ready for it yet.
So I am a world-weary big city lawyer.
Okay.
And I'm returning to my small town just prior to the town-wide celebration of the 4th of July.
I'm on a garbage barge that's being rented out for the fireworks.
Okay, I'm working on the contract with you, and we're arguing over the small pieces in the contract. And we're spending more time together trying to figure this out.
And I think that all you want to do is bilk me and the community at large for money. I think that you don't care about this town at all. I think that you just see me as a means to an end and a means to go back to your firm to prove that you are worthy of bigger and more important contracts. This is a joke to you. But this is the most important 4th of July parade in America, and dang it, we're going to do it right.
In the midst of arguing, I realize that I'm starting to believe more of what you're saying than what I know I'm supposed to be saying because of what my firm says. And I start to realize the spark that's there.
And I start seeing you as not just a cold-hearted city person. I know that you came from a small town just like this, right? Didn't you come from here originally?
Oh, obviously.
Yeah, and then you came back, and I'm like, oh, I remember you. You moved away in 3rd grade. We started in the Christmas play together. I was tree number 4, and you were a goat or something. I don't know.
I go to pass you the pen, and there are fireworks. And
our hands touch.
But fireworks, 4th of July.
Right. No, I'm picking up what you're putting down. I love it. All right. So I think we overcame that obstacle. So now I think I'm hearing you on the phone talking back home. And before the conversation that I walked into, they were accusing you of getting too close and serving the interests of the town before the interests of the firm. And so I walked in to bring you a bouquet of flowers or some nonsense like that.
A bouquet of sparklers.
Oh yes, a bouquet of sparklers that are actively on right now and burning the hell out of my hand. Anyway, and all I hear is you trying to defend yourself to stay on the case because you know you can do more good for the town than any other lawyer in your firm. And to do that, you have to put on a front. You have to say things like, oh, these rubes don't know what's coming. Of course I care more for you than the people in this town. You know, we even have this barge guy eating out of my hand. He thinks we're close. And I'm like, well, that's how you really feel. Good to know now before I gave you this bouquet of...
Before you got burned?
Yeah, increasingly dangerous sparklers in my hand. And then I walk away. I storm off.
I realize I hang up just as the sparklers light disappears, and I realize what's happened. And I realize that I have to make it up. And I don't know how I'm going to make it up, but it has to be big.
I think I might have an idea for that. It's 4th of July. I'm out on my barge, right? And even though we don't get along right now, you're still assigned to make sure everything looks good, right?
Right. I'm doing like final safety checks to make sure that they're following everything in the contract.
Right. Now, you find that there's been some safety stuff that's been overlooked. And your firm is like saying, just ignore it. Don't worry about it. Nothing bad's going to happen. And so you're rushing out to tell me on the barge right as the fireworks go off. So the fireworks start going off. It gets dangerous. I think you swoop in at the last moment on your speedboat.
Because obviously I'm a high-powered lawyer with a speedboat, yep.
Well, you commandeered it at least, and you remember before you moved off in 3rd grade, you learned how to operate a speedboat.
Listen, suspend your disbelief. I'm driving a speedboat.
That's right. And you get there, you save me, and then together, you and I decide that we're going to sue your firm. And you quit, and you represent me, and you use the money to start your own practice right here in some generically named New England town like Cloud Hollow or something.
and we use the settlement money to make the 4th of July bigger and better than it ever has been before.
Well, no, obviously we use it to buy your family home and turn it into a bed and breakfast.
A 4th of July themed bed and breakfast?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
And we smooch and the curtains fall. Romance.
We recognize the formulaicness of these movies. We kind of make fun of it, but we also love it because, like, it's a formula because it works so well. It's not a formula just meh, like, well, I guess we'll just all do this. We'll just plug some stuff in. It's a formula because people are obsessed with them. The idea of the chase and all the, like, emotion and hormonal everything that these movies dredge up with their precise formulas work. Like, there's literally an entire channel for Hallmark movies like this for a reason.
And DMs, if your player expresses interest in a romance, you've got a C plot for your adventure for the next, like, 8 sessions. If you just sprinkle these little bits throughout the games, you're going to create a memorable story. You're going to give them a tie to an NPC, which is, like, the best way to make them do shit they don't want to do. Like, hey, you know that person that you love forever and is a high-powered lawyer from a big city in Neverwinter? Well, she got kidnapped by orcs. Well, shit, they're going to have to save that person, right? See? Use this. Use it. Run with it.
You can have the thread going throughout. Like, literally the entire plot of Gilmore Girls is, like, waiting for Luke and Lorelai to get together and stay together. It's story fuel.
Hey, Richard here, interrupting Nate and Jenna to tell you about a new RPG live on Kickstarter right now. In a complicated profession, players take on the role of ex-bounty hunters who now run an intergalactic cruise ship setting course through dangerous space. This game is a GM-less RPG specifically designed to be played over 1 or 2 sessions. The 40-page zine provides everything you need to create your characters and generate a full adventure without some highfalutin GM trying to tell you what to do. Create your character, outfit your ship, and fulfill contracts in space! Head over to Kickstarter today and grab your copy of the game for yourself. But don't wait. A Complicated Professions campaign wraps up Monday, February 15th. There's a link in the show notes. And now, back to the episode.
So let's talk about some RPGs that actually feature romance as a main part of it that don't kind of shy away. Starting with a game that's a powered by the apocalypse game called Monster Hearts. In Monster Hearts, you play hormonally charged teens who are also some kind of monster. So they call them skins in the game.
That's real creepy.
There's, like, the Chosen, which is a Buffy the Vampire type knockoff. The Fae, you got your Ghost. It's, you know, you get the idea. They're monstrous humans that are teens in usually a high school type setting, and there's a huge romantic contingent about that. Like, you're playing teenagers. It's gonna be, you know, making out in the back of your beat up old Buick, and then going off to try to stop the monster apocalypse that's going to come to destroy the earth. The cool thing about this game, besides that, it's just a really fun game, and it's extremely queer. So if you want representation in your games, this is baked right into the setting. It's awesome. But the publisher of it, Buried Without Ceremony, they wrote an excellent and free guide for best practices when featuring romance in their game.
And it's only 4 pages of text. It's not like it's super lengthy. I mean, and even the last page is more like half a page.
Right. Again, if you're going to be having a game that features romance, spend the 10 minutes to read this and really see and really understand what the best practices are for running this kind of thing in this particular game. They put it out for a reason, and it wasn't just because they wanted to sell you a product, because it's a free inclusion.
Right. And they talk about the importance of taking breaks, which I think is so important, you know, when you're doing intense role playing. Again, the verisimilitude can suck it, because at some point, like, you know, you're a human and you need to walk away for a second.
Tangentially related to Monster Hearts, which is actually right now Monster Hearts 2, there's a pseudo Hallmark role-playing game specifically that uses a lot of or I should say borrow some of the mechanics from Monster Hearts 1 and 2. It's called Warmer in the Winter, and you can get the first edition on DriveThruRPG right now, or I think it's on itch as well. They're going to be kickstarting it soon, the second edition, with a lot more fleshed out resources and mechanics. If you want more information on that, you can tweet at our good friend at _Gamenomicon. That's GAMENOMICON for details.
Okay, and then another game is Starcrossed. It uses the Jenga tower like Dread does, but it's focused on romance. So it's 2 players that absolutely under no circumstances should fall in love. And you're playing through the game and you're drawing blocks from the Jenga tower as you go. And then when the tower finally falls, it's because they've succumbed to their deep love for one another. And they may or may not end up together. It depends on what the tower says and what cards you draw.
There's a lot of weird and kind of beautiful mechanics in that too. For example, if you're going to say something in character, you have to have a hand on the tower. And that just like little bit of stress, especially towards the end, if it's getting a little rickety. Oh, the tension's so beautiful. It's like, I got to say something, but I'm going to fuck this up. So I'm going to touch the tower and say it real quick to you without thinking about what I'm saying. Because I want to get this out so I can take my hand off the damn tower. It's those little touches that make it such a really powerful game. It's a game that as soon as we can get together again, and like maybe we'll Twitch stream it or record it for YouTube and actually have a playthrough of that, because that's a game that I've wanted to play for a long time. The last game that I want to talk about today is actually 3 games, because I'm a cheater like that. It's the Romance Trilogy, which is by the famous Emily Care Boss. It's 1 book, 3 RPGs in it. They're all about love and romance, in case you couldn't tell from the name, the Romance Trilogy. So the first one is called Breaking the Ice, which is a GM-less game where players play through their first few dates. And that's really it. You don't have to go beyond that. It's a couple dates, seeing how it's going to go. Self-contained, great for a one-shot. Shooting the Moon is a 2 to 3 player game about a love triangle. So maybe we can finally have our polyamory or bisexual Hallmark movie. And the last one is Under My Skin is a LARP romance game for 4 to 8 players. In the game, you're playing a group of friends that are falling in and out of love with one another.
So you're playing the cast of Friends.
Yeah. And no one told you life was going to be this way. If I was ever going to play that game, oh boy, the session 0 I would have would be as long as the game itself. Because you need to be like completely explicit in terms of what you're comfortable with and what you're not.
I feel like in that situation, you need to either be all single people or all swingers. If you're like a generally monogamous person in relationships, like you couldn't do this as like a double date, because that would just explode everything.
Just Google Under My Skin RPG and you will see a cover of this game. It depicts someone's back with a variety of different hands touching them all at the same time.
And it's like a sweaty back. Ooh, and one of the people has a wedding ring on. Ooh, at least two people do.
Yeah. 3. I see
3. Oh my gosh.
3 wedding rings on a naked back. I don't think that's going to be on Sesame Street. If it is, I'm going to probably change the channel because something's gone wrong. These games are widely praised, but listen to this episode before you run any of them and really get down to brass tacks about what you can expect, what you want out of a game, and what your lines and veils are. And there's another game that we're going to play for the podcast, and that episode will be coming out after this episode. It's called I Kissed Mothman Behind the Arby's. And it's a cryptid rom-com simulator for 2 players by Handtaub. You can get on itch like I did. I think it's like $3. It is what it says on the tin. You're playing, one of your people are playing a cryptid of some sort, maybe Bigfoot, maybe Nessie. I'm not here to judge. The other person's playing a human. And it's an interchange where some of you are giving up, like the cryptid is giving up their monstrosity throughout the game, and the human is giving up their humanity throughout the game. And at the end, you try to see who leaned further throughout the game, who gave up the most, and how did that color their relationship. I think this is a really good introduction to romance games because it's goofy. It has that veneer of like, everyone's being funny. Look, I'm making out with Vakali and Bembe.
You were sort of on the fence about mentioning the Book of Erotic Fantasy. So I looked it up.
Oh, you did?
On Amazon.
Why? All right.
There is one collectible format of it, hardcover, that sells for $246.
Are we going to talk about the Book of Erotic Fantasy?
It describes it as addressing the issues of sex, love, seduction, marriage, and pregnancy.
Let's back up a little bit. The Book of Erotic Fantasy is a third-party game that was put out for 3rd and 3.5 edition D&D. You know, they had a Book of Violet Darkness for D&D. This is that, but for sex. It's not good.
There's just so much going on here.
There are custom classes for this book. Like the Tantrist, it's, as 1D4chan describes it, a sex wizard. There's Kundala, where you're like a monk, but for sex. There's the
The
Images,
sacred
which
prostitute?
is... Oh, that's one of the prestige classes. Yes, the prestige classes are great. There's a harem protector. There's the BDSM one, the knot binder of Kalatus. The voyeuristic seer. I love that one. It's like a divination wizard, but they're also a huge pervert.
They cover STDs in this?
Oh yeah, there's a whole lot about STDs. There's an entire system for how to sustain sex with like constitution checks. And how
Like, how long do you last, but rolling for con?
Yeah, but it also means like it gets more challenging if the size variants of the creature are different.
That is really granular.
So like if you're a leprechaun fucking a troll, like that takes more energy, I guess. And in 3 and 3.5 there was a skill called performance. Well, don't worry, because now you can specialize in performance sexual techniques. And if you have 5 or more ranks in that, you get a +2. So that's something to look forward to in case you're really interested in that. I don't know why we started talking about this, Jen. Why did you bring up the Book of Erotic Fantasy?
Well, because you had mentioned maybe bringing it up or not, and so I want, like, we were talking about the cover of the other book, and so I was wondering, like, oh, I wonder what the cover of this book is.
Oh,
so I looked it up with D&D in the search bar because I wasn't just going to Google Book of Erotic Fantasy because I'm not a moron.
You guys made a good choice there, babe.
And went to Amazon because, safe in terms of, I'm not going to, like, open this and all of a sudden, like, images that I don't expect or want popping up on my screen. And then I saw the price and I couldn't not mention it once I saw that they were selling a quote-unquote collectible for $246.
There are plenty of spells that are specific to this book. Like instead of grease, you have lubrication. And there's also a grope spell.
Wait, shut up. There's a mystic pimp?
That's all I've ever wanted to be in life. When I had, in 5th grade, I had one of those, like, tests you take, the aptitude tests.
Uh-huh.
And I asked for Mystic Pimp, but they said police officer. Thank you so much for bringing up the Book of Erotic Fantasy and just completely derailing the end of this episode.
Listen, I know that you deeply wanted to talk about it, so I just gave you the entree into being like, what though? To be fair.
Uh-huh.
They've clearly invested a lot of thought into it.
I never thought the sentence would pass my lips.
Oh, God.
Here's my problem with the Book of Erotic Fantasy. So many of the spells and abilities and what have you depicted in this are how to circumvent consent.
Well,
that's gross.
that is gross.
There's orgasmic vibrations, mass. How you can give everyone an orgasm. Or like irrational attraction. Seduction is a spell. So you like dominate this person to sleep with you? Like you fucking magically roofie them? That's gross, man. Maybe next Valentine's Day, we'll really dive deep into the Book of Erotic Fantasy and then take a shower afterwards because it's fucking gross.
Take home lesson. Consent is everything. You have to have informed consent, so having that session 0 where you know what's okay and what's not. It has to be continuous and enthusiastic. Once that stops, you have to stop because then it's no longer fun exploration and now it's passed over into just being gross.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to your partners at the table. Period.
Well said. And that's all for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again next week. If you like what you heard and want to support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Want more actual plays, reviews, homebrew content? Check us out on potofblunders.com, and be sure to follow us on Twitter @potofblunders, all one word, to keep up with our latest releases and information. We love to hear from you, so if you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach us at contact@potofblunders.com. For the Pot of Blunders, I'm Nate Magnuski, and as always, may all your D's be 12s. Hello, and welcome to another sensual episode of the Pot of Blunders. Let me try that again so I remember the actual name.
Did you just forget the name
podcast.
of your podcast?
It's been a long day. Richard will have a field day listening to that.